Welcome to the Skapa Podcast, Creating the Future with me, Michael Brasseur.
And me, Rob Murray.
The Skapa Podcast invites visionary leaders across what we call the triple helix, government, academia, and industry, and asks them to share their ideal future unconstrained by the past.
And together, what we want to be able to do is explore what it's going to take to turn those visions into reality, discussing the necessary innovations, strategic shifts, collaborative efforts to bring about genuine transformative change across defense and security.
And just to be clear, Rob, this is not a podcast for looking back or the here and now. This is all about understanding the future and how to translate big, bold ideas into reality.
And today is going to be a cracker. We have got the renowned technology futurist, Peter Singer, joining us. And Peter is a strategist for the New America Foundation, a professor of practice at Arizona State University, and founder and managing partner at Useful Fiction. But fundamentally, Peter, you are without doubt an absolutely acclaimed world star writer, described by the Wall Street Journal as the premier futurist in the national security environment. And you're perhaps best known for the concept of fictional intelligence, this hybrid of narrative and research analysis, really designed both to educate and to entertain. And so it is fabulous that you have taken some time to be able to join us today, and so we can have a discussion on all things warfare, future, and technology. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, and also for that kind welcome. I worry, though, maybe you're weaving some fiction there and how over the top you were.
Hey, Peter, I have the first question here, and it's good to see you. I consider you a friend and an inspiration for a lot of the work I did in government and now continue in industry. Peter, you've written extensively about the future of warfare. When you think about your vision of the future, what excites you and what worries you?
Wow, that's a really big one to launch our conversation with. I think I'm most excited by all the possibilities that are opened up by many of the technologies that you all have been wrestling with as well and are on top of everyone's minds, which is the cross between the software side of artificial intelligence and the hardware side of robotics. And, I see it very much like we're living through a new industrial revolution. It opens up incredible possibilities that were, pure science fiction at the start of our careers. And now they're here, and we're only scraping the surface of it. And, I think you could see that in everything from, whether you care about entertainment, you care about business, you care about military acquisitions, doctrine, tactics. I mean, every single area we're seeing an opening up of incredible new possibilities. What worries me is that we, and in this I'm framing it, we, the United States, our allies in NATO and partners in democracies around the world, that we are not keeping pace with this. And that in particular, I worry about we're not keeping pace with how the math is changing. Let me unpack that a little bit. We're not in a world anymore where bigger is better. We're in a world where orders of magnitude are what matter now, whether it's orders of magnitude in your algorithms, to orders of magnitude in the information that you're collecting and analyzing to operate on the battlefield or in business, to orders of magnitude where we're talking about the weapons that are out there flying against you, and maybe you ought to think about flying them out. So let's boil this down to a more specific example. Look at what's playing out in Ukraine right now, where we have not unmanned, uncrewed, robotic, drone, whatever phraseology you want to use, We have them flying not in the tens, not in the hundreds, not in the thousands. We're now moving into the tens of thousands. That is both, our allies operating them, but also the adversary. They're flying them at the most minute tactical level. Not a platoon goes out without worrying about being detected by a drone or they're being supported by a drone. But it's also playing out at the strategic level when we think about the strikes back and forth between Ukraine and Russia, reaching hundreds of kilometers, to the effect that it's had, something that you all know very well on the naval side, where Ukraine has had not much of a navy, but has been able to sink or disable half of Russia's Black Sea fleet. So just all those kind of changes. But, think about this on the defense side. We have a situation where most of our counter UAS systems that are being expected to defend against drones and or cruise missiles, loitering munitions, how they all come together, that cost, if we're talking about the smaller versions, they're around $500 to $750. We're talking about the larger versions, they're being generous, $50,000. And look at NATO militaries and their partners. It's anything from $125,000 counter drone system per shot to ones that are using converted air-to-air missiles, where we're moving up into multiple hundreds of thousands per shot, to, if we're talking about something like some of our larger scale surface-to-air missiles, it's $4 million per shot. I mean, the equations aren't going to work with us there. And that was just to give a micro example. And so that's what worries me, is that we're going to get the math wrong.
So just drilling into that in further detail, Peter, because when we think about military strategy, and I think the Ukraine example is a good one, and whilst it may not be a blueprint for the future, I think there's unquestionable signposts that we're seeing from Ukraine. And I wonder how what we're seeing with Ukraine, perhaps with also what you're seeing, hearing, reading with the conflict in the Middle East, Israel, how you think that might impact the future of military strategy. And it kind of touches upon some of the points you've just made. And I'm struck by a dinner I went to a week or two ago in London, and I heard the Chief of the General Staff, the head of the British Army, really focusing on this notion of dispersal. And the point being that in Ukraine right now, if you are a platoon moving tactically across the battlefield, you're one big target. And so anything with more than 4 or 5 people as a grouping is very targeted by the myriad of drones that are existing there. And so I just wonder how some of these technologies are impacting tactics and actually at a military strategy perspective, how you see this potentially evolving based upon this new industrial revolution that you just described.
Wow, so many different directions we can go into that. So one, you're very rightly point out that we need to be drawing lessons, not just from Ukraine, but from conflicts all over the world. And indeed, many of the lessons that we saw with just this, this one topic of the utility of drones in a conventional conflict, to the challenges of defending against them, that played out in prior conflicts. Armenia, Azerbaijan, we just didn't pay attention to it as much. To lessons coming out of what's playing out in the Middle East. So, on one hand, we have Israel's, and depending on multiple partner states, success so far when you and I are speaking against high number missile strikes. Which, it was a combination of ballistic, cruise, drone, and they did relatively well against that kind of large-scale attack, but did so, in a circumstance that's going to be difficult for others to replicate in terms of They were able to plan for this. They know what direction it's coming from just by the geography, the who's launching against them, the information flow quite open. The adversary's not, doing electronic warfare, cyber, etc. And so, but the point is that, we've shifted from thinking about I need to defend myself against onesies and twosies to no, it's in this case hundreds, but now move that to another actor, a Russia, a China, et cetera, and you could see the difficulty not just in the fact that the numbers will be greater, but also all the other things they can do. But there's an important lesson that played out just a couple of days from when you and I are speaking. Despite having this incredible integrated air defense with, and knowing exactly where the threat's coming from, et cetera, and being able to conduct a massive air campaign to suppress. Israel just suffered the loss of 4 soldiers from a small drone that made its way and hit one of their bases. So it's a reminder that, again, there's not going to be some silver bullet solution as long as we continue to defend in the same way. It may be a realization of so Mike said we shouldn't talk history, but I'm going to do that. I'm going to violate it in a couple of ways. You think about the lesson from there was the famous speech by a British politician in the 1930s saying that at some point the bomber will get through. Maybe that might be the case in the world of high numbers that you couldn't achieve with manned systems. I don't know, but the point is defenses are going to be more difficult. Second, I think you hit really well that we see the signs of these in lots of different conflicts, and they point to changes going on around us, and not just technology, but the tactics, the doctrine that you might use. I think a parallel for what's certainly happening in Ukraine is the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s. Again, Mike, sorry, I'm going to do history on you. And I think it's not just because of this, question of are you going to step in against an authoritarian ideology before it gets worse, but also this idea of there are a series of technologies that had already been used in war. They've gotten better, but they've also are being brought together in new ways. Back then, it was the tank, the airplane, the radio. Today, it's AI, it's robotics, it's precision munitions, and related to that, it means that there's not just new ways of seeking to win the battle, but also new legal, ethical questions that we weren't wrestling with before. Back then, it was aerial bombing of cities, which led to of Guernica, that then led to new forms of art. Today, it's things like autonomous weapon systems. But again, even we're seeing AI affect art. The final thing that you bring in, though, is that I don't believe it alters strategy. I think that's at a higher level than doctrine, but it kind of depends on how we define it. But I think, some of the core strategies remain the same. But and then also the ways that you defend yourself, the lessons are still the same, but it now, it reaches either higher numbers, more complexity, or weaving in new technology. So, as you talked about it, there's always been a value on if I am under threat, there's a couple of things that I can try to do, whether, I was, working together as a group of knights or tanks, or now I'm out in Ukraine. One is to try and avoid detection, to hide. Another is to disperse, to spread out. Another is deception, make the enemy think something else. And then finally is I can try and defend myself. we've not had in certain of these areas, we've not thought about them as much over the last couple of decades because the adversaries that we've been facing, the kind of technology edge that we had, we didn't have to think about, dispersion or as much on deception, say dealing with insurgents. But we did have to think about it back during the Cold War or even during World War II. Deception campaigns like the Ghost Army that made the Germans think that the Allies were going to invade in a different place than Normandy. To defend, how are you defending yourself? Again, there were certain defenses that we've set up that were appropriate for Iraq, be it Saddam or be it insurgents, that are not appropriate now. And I think one of the big issues we're going to have to figure out is where in the defenses, one, how are they cost effective? How do they deal with numbers? But also, where are you intervening against that adversary? Are you defending yourself up close, or are you trying to get left of boom, so to speak? And I've not seen as much thinking about that, or certainly deployment into seeing it deploying out in the field as I'd like to see.
Peter, fascinating sort of tour of the Middle East and Europe. I wanted to allude to a fact that you mentioned, that geography has a factor here, and I wanted to sort of take the discussion towards the Pacific and the way you see a potential conflict playing out there. What will be decisive? What could be a critical deterrent? And then also sort of pull that thread. I'm assuming when you expressed this worry that you have, that we're essentially in a race and in danger of losing. I would venture to guess you are referring to China as far as the technological race that we're in. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. And if you want to refer to any sort of historical examples, that's absolutely fantastic. You're the first futurist we've had on the show, and actually you've referred to the history the most, which I think there's so much to learn from that. But Peter, if you could just talk a little bit about the Pacific and how you see these themes sort of playing out there.
So, for very obvious reasons, much of our work at Useful Fiction, helping organizations like NATO, different parts of the U.S. military to envision the future, to take really complicated topics, new technologies, new doctrine, strategy papers, you name it, and turn them into explanatory scenarios. Much of it has been recently set in different parts of the Pacific because that's top of mind for our partners. And I'll share two that I think display the different approaches and the different possibilities. One was a project originally for Special Operations Command, and like many different organizations, they are looking at both the changes in technology and the changes in geopolitics, particularly a world where the demand signals are less counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, and more great power, competition, and maybe even conflict, and saying, what does this mean for us? And they've developed a new strategy. And that what does this mean for us is everything from their overall roles and missions to what do they buy to how do they train their forces? Because it's a very different situation, whether you are a young lieutenant to you're a 2-star in the organization. It's a different world. And so they have a strategy for that. And we worked with them to take their strategy and to turn it into scenarios of what would winning look like? So if our strategy achieves success, what would it look like? And one of the projects was essentially displayed what I think is the ultimate version of victory. And the story is a PLA, a Chinese general in the future, is looking back and reflecting upon why they never invaded Taiwan. because victory doesn't look like defeating the enemy on the beaches of Taiwan, or if we could have the very same discussion if we were talking about fjords in Scandinavia by chance. That's not victory. Ultimate victory is deterrence. It's the enemy saying, this is not the day to go to war. And that day being every single day moving forward. And so this general is looking back on all the dastardly things that democracies did to make it such that it never was a good day to go to war. And it encompasses a lot of the topics that we've talked about, whether it's they've figured out new technologies, they've figured out this quantity problem, so they've figured out how to protect their logistics, how to protect their supply chain. They figured out how to be resilient against cyber and information warfare attacks. And gosh darn it, it just never worked out for us. And part of that was also the innovation side. Every time we thought we had an advantage, they changed enough that we were suddenly playing a very different game. So that's what winning looks like. There's a different project we did for the US Army that looked at what does losing appear like. And the narrative is essentially a letter by a US Army officer in the future who's writing to his war college mentor and apologizing for the decision that he had to make that he knows you've heard about, but I feel obligated to explain to you because you're my mentor, and hopefully maybe somehow you can help others to be not put in this position. So I'm sharing my lessons learned. And essentially what he shares is all the mistakes that we made, all the changes that we didn't undertake, and in particular, not just on the edge, but how we never shored up our logistics, because the Pacific logistics is so central to anything that you might do out there. And basically the reveal at the end, he's surrendering his unit. And people go, that would never happen. No US officer would make that decision. And back to history, the inspiration for it is the situation of Major Devereaux at Wake Island in 1942, who was forced in this impossible position because the war didn't play out the way that we planned. And in particular, the spare parts, the supply chain had put him in a situation where it was he was going to lose, and it was just whether he was going to sacrifice his unit in a loss that he wasn't going to be able to win. And so I give you these two scenarios as illustrations of the useful fiction approach, because hopefully the takeaway is it both helps identify, the steps that we either want to take to make something happen, or the steps that we want to ensure doesn't happen, but also adds in that dose of emotion where we go, oh, I like that world. I like that world where we never ever go to war, or oh my gosh, I don't ever want to see that world where some officer is put in that position. What can I do to make sure that never ever happens?
Peter, fascinating sort of couple of examples there. I actually want to share a personal example. I think over your right shoulder there is the book Burn-In, if I can see that correctly. And I read that book, and it is a useful fiction. And for me, I won't destroy the narrative for everybody that wants to read it and they haven't. I did do a review on it online, so if you want to check that out. But it's essentially a story about trust between human and machine. And, I saw that play out when I was launching Task Force 59. And, you have these machines and you need to burn them in the operational environment. And we actually had a part of our capability sprint model was called the burn-in, where we were taking these robots to the operational limit versus real problems in the real world. And that sort of key component of our process out there was inspired by your book, The Burn-In. And just wanted to thank you for envisioning the future, writing so clearly about it, challenging the reader to place themselves in the future, And I just wanted to let you know that it was an inspiration for me as I was standing up Task Force 59, and it continues to be guide some of our work here at Skapa, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But yeah, I know, Rob, a big thing for you is trust, not only between human and machine, but between humans in the space that we operate. But yeah, just wanted a quick follow up there.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, it hit me really a week or two ago when I was at a conference, and it feels to me that in this environment, this national security environment, which we all work in from different angles, whatever we kind of look at it from, we're all actually really trading in the currency of trust. And that is something which I think it's a bit squidgy. It's difficult to define. It's very hard to wrap some hard metrics around it. But that is what that's what we're talking about here. Trust, between governments and academics and industrialists and technologists and operators and so on and so forth, that actually, for that system to work fundamentally, it must have high levels of trust. And when you start to think about cognitive warfare and you start to think about those activities that the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army are leveraging, really what that's trying to do is erode those bonds of trust. And so, we've got to be cognizant of that. But I wonder, just stepping back, Peter, I'd love to know more about useful fiction. I'd like to understand, how well that, you used the example of the US Special Forces Command, the Special Operations Command. How well was that received in terms of your process? And actually, how easy is it for defense and national security people to kind of work in the context and environment which you're trying to bring with that futurist mindset? And maybe before delving into that, how did you get into this? How have you ended up here? How's this path been taken?
So the origin point for useful fiction was myself and my partner on it, August Cole, who is the co-writer of the books that you've kindly mentioned. We both, come out of the nonfiction national security world. I'd written a number of books that were on the different Navy reading lists on topics that ranged from robotics to cyber warfare. August had been front page, articles in the Wall Street Journal. He was a Wall Street Journal defense reporter. But years back, we identified a series of topics that we felt were not getting enough attention, or people had the wrong take on it. And they ranged from many of the things that we've talked about, the rising challenge of great power competition, to supply chains, to cyber threats. And we decided that the best way to break through all the noise was to do something that we'd always wanted to do as little kids, which was to combine it with a novel. So Ghost Fleet was a smash up. It was a useful fiction. It was a novel, like a Tom Clancy, envisioning what a war between the U.S. and Russia and China might look like, which again, now top of mind, but was not back then. But the second part of the smash up was it had 27 pages of research and notes. And the design of it was you were using the scenes, you were using characters, plot, etc., to carry through those real world lessons. So a different way of thinking about useful fiction is it's what I do to my kids in the morning. I sneak fruit and veggies into a smoothie. Just in this case, the fruit and veggies are facts, are research. And the target audience is not kids, but 4-star admirals to officers out in the Middle East, you name it, or parliamentarians. And so that was the origin of it, and it ended up having greater policy impact than anything that we'd worked on. And so then that led to not just a validation of the approach, but organizations ranging from the Norwegian Army to the U.S. Congress came to us and said, well, we like what you did, but could you do it on our topic and our nonfiction rather than what you want to do? And so that's led to this broader project, where since we started, we've worked with over 60 different organizations that range from NATO to, as I referenced, Special Operations Command, of Fortune 100 companies. And basically, there's this shared problem that they all have, which is, how do I tell the story of dot, dot, dot? And it might be, how do I tell the story of my new strategy? Or how do I tell the story of this new complicated technology? And part of how do I tell the story, there's this to whom. And it might be, how do I tell the story to people in my organization? We're just not getting traction with it. Or it might be, how do I tell the story to my external partners? And so far, it's been great, and the uptake has been fantastic. And one of the things that's the value side of deploying narrative is not just that it's more likely to be consumed. The science shows the facts are more likely to be absorbed by the brain, a lot like smoothie and vitamins. But the other thing is, what's been really cool and often unexpected for these partners is, human beings, we like to connect over story. And so the products are going viral. They're hitting not just their original audience, but other groups. We have had products for ministries of defense that was for their own officers that have ended up being read by two different prime ministers. We did a project for SOCOM that envisioned their strategy, and it's used in teaching their young officers and NCOs. But it's also been used in briefings for Congress. It's now on the curricula at West Point. West Point was not the target, but a whole new generation of officers are being educated. And we actually got feedback from the professors who let us know about it. We didn't even know it was there. They reached out to say, not only are we using it, but kind of unsurprisingly, the cadets like it better than the old school stuff. So that's what's been neat and again, I think it points out, everything from I won't say the ages of the prime ministers to 18-year-old cadets. It I think shows the value of it. And again, I need to be very clear. It's not a replacement for the strategy paper or the doctrine. It runs alongside it. It's designed to create more effect out of it.
Peter, fascinating sort of skill set you have to bring all these very sort of abstract concepts to life in a powerful narrative. I think it's so important to not only the end user, but to policymakers. And I wanted to go a little bit deeper on one of the emerging technologies we've talked about. And of course, that's artificial intelligence. And go sort of inside the black box, so to speak, and talk about responsible AI, ethical AI. We at Skapa by Saab are doing some game-changing work in there, some industry. We're on the front end of this. And I just wanted to get your perspective to sort of demystify and humanize artificial intelligence, and is it possible to inject our ethics into it, or is it possible to deploy artificial intelligence in a responsible way? And just this is, once all the fairy dust settles on this, I think this is going to be a very important sort of topic and key sort of factor we need to figure out.
I don't think, at least within the next several years, we're going to be in any kind of position to, as you phrased it, inject our ethics into the system. And maybe, I don't even know if that's ever possible. It sort of depends on how you define ethics, because for some people, it's ethical if you do the right thing, right being amorphous. For others, intention matters. And a machine will never have intent, right? And think about this even in our legal system. If you get in a car wreck, we say, was it an accident? Or were you irresponsible, you were drunk, or maybe you intended to do it, manslaughter. So I don't think we'll ever be able to weave in that part. However, and this is where, you see many governments and many corporations, which is they're saying, but I want to inject ethics into the process of designing, building, selling, deploying that technology. And that's where I do see some good approaches, not so ironically coming out of not Silicon Valley, but actually more the defense space. As an example, the US Defense Department had a process in building their AI principles and policy that a lot like what we were talking about in narrative, they started out by bringing together a diverse set of groups. It was everything from technologists to lawyers to potential users. So they got multiple different viewpoints involved. Second, they ran a series of both scenarios and some of the things that you were even part of, Mike, of deploying it out in war games and testing. And the goal was not to replicate every single situation that might happen in the world, because that's impossible. But the goal was to unearth possibilities, possible uses, possible misuses. What might adversaries do? And then we'll learn from that. Then they use those use cases to identify a set of common principles and values that these diverse actors could all agree upon. And then those principles became the basis of a policy that then they could reach out to other partners and other governments and industry and say, do you want to join on this as well? And so that's how you get something that's more realistic than either what we've seen too many Silicon Valley companies, which is, I'm a set of engineers, I'm a billionaire, I'm going to beta test it on the world, I'm just going to push it out there, and if people die, so much, we're going to learn from it. And that 2.0, that was fine for restaurant apps. It's not even fine for social media. It's definitely not fine for hardware like robotic systems. But then you have the other end of the spectrum, which is waiting for the United Nations to come up with the rules for AI. That's just not going to happen. Or if it is, they're going to be so watered down or ignored by adversaries like Russia and China. So I think this process of trying to inject what are the right questions, what are the issues of morality, legality, in each of the stages of the process, and then using that as building blocks for partners. I think that's the way to go about it.
Just picking up on that, there's a very obscure entity called the International Telecommunications Union, Subcommittee 42, I believe, is where AI standards are written, and the role the Chinese state, either through the political entities there or through their industrial colleagues, are taking in terms of defining technological standards. And of course, those technological standards, they reflect one's values. So even if they are ultimately code, at some point somebody has had to write that, and to some extent is predicated upon their own values. And so, yes, there is a real challenge here, as you rightly say, Peter, as to, okay, how do we kind of own those standards and standard setting bodies such that they reflect democratic values and shared values across democracies, which is far, far easier said than done. But let me come on to the last question as we look at time here now. And I'm going to borrow your professor hat and I'm going to wear it for a moment. And I'm going to ask you if you can offer just one piece of advice to policymakers and military leaders who are looking at preparing for future conflict. What would it be?
What a tough one. A good piece of advice, whether it is strategy, budgeting, writing, or fashion, it's often not about what you add, it's about what you take out. So in fashion, it was Coco Chanel who said, right before you go out, you should look in a mirror and take one thing off your outfit. In writing, the idea that's usually credited to Faulkner is the notion of kill your darlings, that after you've written something, a draft, you look it over and you cut things out, and that you should be willing to kill your darlings, whether it is a character that's you loved it, you created it, but it's just not doing the work. You're writing a memo. I say this to my students, or an essay. Find the weakest sentence in that essay. There's definitely a weakest sentence. Cut it out. In defense, budgets, and strategy, it's often not what's the new thing we're going to do. What's the old thing we're going to stop doing? And that's the hard part. But that's often the key to change. So if I could, one lesson is that if you want to be embracing the future, there's something that you're going to have to stop doing from the past.
Wow, what a very sort of thoughtful idea to sort of finish on, Peter. And it's just been a fascinating discussion. For me, Rob, the big takeaway was a couple of things. Number one, yes, this is the future is going to be shaped by these technologies, but in the end, it's shaped by the characters in this useful fiction as it plays out. And then number two, the power of narrative, the power of storytelling in terms of envisioning the future, telling a story about that future, and then taking bold action to realize that vision. That's I mentioned it earlier in the podcast. Peter was an inspiration for the work that I did at Task Force 59, and it continues to be an inspiration for the work we're doing at Skapa as we try and create the future. Peter, I don't know if you know, but Skapa means to create, and that's exactly kind of what Rob and I have embarked on here at Saab is sort of creating the future of defense and security, ultimately to keep people and society safe. So I just want to thank you for your time this day and a really sort of thought-provoking discussion. Rob, do you want to wrap us up?
Absolutely.
And with your thoughts?
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Well, Peter, it's been a tour de force. Thank you so much. I think we'd be talking for a long time today because there's so much to unpack here. I think Michael has summarized it beautifully. And I would just say to our audience, thank you for joining us today on the Skapa Podcast. Do not forget to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and join us next time when we will continue our discussions with leading voices from across the military, academia, and industry. Peter Singer, thank you.